In tonight's episode, we are going to dive into not one but two of Asia's most unsettling ghost stories. Tales so eerie that even the locals hesitate to speak of them after dark. And the first of these stories takes us to Johor Bahru, Malaysia, where a decaying mansion perched above Danga Bay has become the center of countless whispers, rumors, and disappearances. They call it Villa Nabila. Once a grand bungalow, now just a hollow shell strangled by vines and shadows. To passers-by, it is nothing more than a ruin, but to those who dare to enter, it is a place where the air turns heavy, where footsteps echo even when no one is there, and where windows glow though no electricity flows inside. The kind of place that makes you feel you are being watched, even when you are standing in broad daylight. But what truly cements Villa Nabila's reputation is not just its eerie silence or rotting walls. It's the legend of a night in 2013 when whispers spread that more than 20 teenagers had entered the house and never returned. Police claimed it was an exaggeration, that only one boy had been missing. But even with that explanation, the story refused to die. Because in Villa Nabila, every rumor feels possible, and every shadow could be real. The story begins in Johor Bahru, a city where the streets are alive with food stalls, bright lights, and the constant hum of cars heading toward the causeway that connects Malaysia to Singapore. But just beyond the lively streets and glittering bayfront sits something entirely different, something that feels removed from time itself. Perched on a hill overlooking Danga Bay is Villa Nabila, a once grand home that has been left to rot in silence. From a distance, it looks like nothing more than an abandoned mansion, but those who know the story feel a chill even glancing at its broken windows. Our focus tonight is on a boy named Hafiz. He was 16 years old in 2013, just an ordinary teenager in Johor Bahru, restless, curious, and eager to impress his friends. It was the kind of boredom only teenagers understand, where a dare feels more exciting than reason, and the thought of sneaking into a haunted house is not something to fear, but something to brag about the next day. For Hafiz and his small group of friends, Villa Nabila wasn't just a house, it was a test, a place where bravery could be proven and fear could be laughed off. But as they approached the hill that night, the mood began to shift. The road that led up to Villa Nabila was cracked, lined with trees that seemed to bend toward them, their branches scratching in the breeze. The air was strangely still, the sounds of the city below muffled as if swallowed by the house itself. Hafiz, normally quick to joke, found himself unusually quiet, his eyes fixed on the dark silhouette at the top of the hill. The villa itself loomed like a corpse of another era. Its once white walls were now stained grey and green with age. Vines crawled over the balcony like veins wrapping around dead skin. The iron gate that guarded the property hung half open, rust eating through the metal, as though even it had given up the effort of keeping intruders away. Stories of what had happened inside whispered through Hafiz's mind. A wealthy family murdered by a jealous relative, a housemaid who had been wronged and cursed the land, shadows of past owners who never left. No one knew the exact truth, but everyone seemed to know a version of it. The group of friends pushed on, their laughter now forced, too loud for the silence that pressed against them. One of them pulled out a phone to record, shaking it slightly like a torch against the darkness. The glow of the screen reflected against broken glass in the windows, and for just a moment Hafiz thought he saw movement inside. Just a flicker, a shift of shadow. But when he blinked, it was gone. They reached the cracked stairs that led up to the main entrance. Each step groaned under their weight, as if the house itself was protesting their presence. The air smelled damp, moldy, mixed with something sharper, like rust or dried blood. Hafiz slowed his pace, suddenly aware of how his own footsteps echoed louder than they should have. He glanced over his shoulder, expecting to see someone behind them, but the stairs were empty. Inside, the villa was hollow, gutted of furniture, but not of presence. The walls were peeling, graffiti scrawled across them, but beneath the vandalism there was something older, darker, etched into the very bones of the building. Hafiz stood at the threshold, torn between stepping deeper or backing away, but his pride held him in place. This was why they had come. To prove themselves. To walk into the belly of the most haunted house in Malaysia and come out laughing. What Hafiz didn't know was that Villa Nabila has a way of changing people. That every laugh would sound quieter inside, every shadow would feel thicker, every heartbeat louder. And though they had come searching for nothing more than a thrill, the house was waiting for them with something else entirely, something far more terrifying. The first steps into the villa were like stepping into a mouth that swallowed sound. Outside, the crickets had been loud, the wind restless in the trees. But inside, everything seemed muted, as though the walls themselves absorbed noise. Hafiz's friend pointed the phone light around, sweeping across the wide, empty foyer. Dust floated in the air like ash, disturbed only by their movement. There was no furniture left, only broken tiles, scraps of plaster, and the skeleton of a chandelier that hung crooked from the ceiling, its crystal teeth long since shattered. At first, there was a nervous kind of laughter, the kind that says, "Nothing's happening, this is fine." But it didn't take long for the unease to settle in. Hafiz noticed it first when he saw a smear on the far wall. At a glance, it looked like graffiti, red spray paint, like the dozens of other tags left behind by trespassers. But the closer he stared, the less it looked like words, and the more it looked like a handprint, a long, streaked handprint that dragged down the wall until it disappeared into shadow. "Paint," his friend muttered quickly, trying to sound confident, but no one moved closer to check. The handprint stayed there, quiet and waiting, as if daring them to prove otherwise. The group moved deeper, past the foyer and into a wide corridor that stretched into darkness. Their footsteps echoed strangely. Sometimes it sounded like there were 5 of them, sometimes 6. Hafiz tried to ignore it, telling himself it was just the way sound bounced through the hollow house. But then came the smell. It was faint at first, like something spoiled. As they passed a doorway, the odor hit them in a wave. Rotten, metallic, the unmistakable stench of decay. They shined their lights inside. The room was empty except for a collapsed chair and the remains of a curtain clinging to one corner of a window. Nothing that should have smelled so strong. Hafiz covered his nose with his sleeve, feeling the bile rising in his throat. But when they stepped away, the smell vanished, as though it had been waiting only in that one spot. The unease grew heavier. The laughter quieted down. Hafiz noticed one of his friends constantly glancing over his shoulder, his face pale in the glow of the phone screen. "Did you hear that?" the boy asked. Everyone froze. There it was, faint but clear, a sound from upstairs. The steady drag of footsteps moving slowly across the floor above them. They all knew the stories. People claimed Villa Nabila was filled with restless spirits, that you could hear them pacing the halls when no one else was inside. Still, Hafiz tried to rationalize. "Could be rats," he said quickly, though the words rang hollow even in his own ears. Rats didn't walk like that. Rats didn't drag their feet one heavy step at a time. The group exchanged uneasy glances. They should have left then, but the pull of curiosity was stronger than common sense. One of them suggested going upstairs, and though Hafiz's stomach twisted at the thought, he didn't object. Not when all of them were watching. They moved toward the staircase. Each step creaked under their weight, the wood soft from years of neglect. The air grew colder as they climbed, the kind of chill that didn't come from open windows, but from something unseen. Hafiz felt it sinking into his skin, pressing against his bones. At the landing, they paused. The hallway stretched out before them, lined with empty doorways, each one like an open mouth waiting to swallow them. The footsteps had stopped. The silence now was worse than the sound, heavy and expectant. Hafiz's throat was dry, his palms damp. One of his friends raised the phone light, sweeping it across the hallway. The beam flickered for just a second, like the battery was dying. And in that flicker, Hafiz thought he saw something, a figure at the far end of the hall. Tall, unmoving, its head bowed slightly forward. By the time the light steadied, the hallway was empty again. "Did you see that?" Hafiz whispered, his voice barely audible. No one answered, but he could tell from their faces that he hadn't been the only one. Then came the whisper. It was soft, almost like a sigh, drifting from one of the rooms. No words, just a sound that curled through the darkness, like smoke. The group froze. Hafiz's heart pounded in his chest, his instincts screaming to run. But still, not one of them moved. The first complication had arrived, though none of them knew it yet. What had begun as a dare was no longer a game. The house was awake, and it wanted them to keep going. The hallway above was colder than the night air outside. Hafiz felt it immediately, a sharp chill that made his skin prickle and his breath hang faintly in the beam of the phone light. The group stood shoulder to shoulder, each of them silently hoping someone else would make the first move. Then, almost as if pushed forward by pride alone, one of Hafiz's friends muttered, "Come on," and stepped into the hallway. The rest followed reluctantly, their footsteps muffled by a carpet long since rotted away. The first door they passed stood half open, its hinges rusted and bent. The smell of damp wood clung to the air, but underneath it was something sharper, metallic, almost copper-like. Hafiz's friend nudged the door with his shoe, and it swung open slowly. The room inside was bare, just cracked walls and a broken window. But carved into the plaster were words, faint, jagged letters that looked as though they had been scratched in desperation. "Jangan masuk," do not enter. The group exchanged uneasy looks. Someone let out a nervous laugh, brushing it off as the work of thrill-seekers before them. But Hafiz's chest tightened. The letters weren't sprayed or painted. They had been gouged deep, as though whoever carved them wanted to make sure the warning lasted forever. They moved further down the hallway. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by the groan of floorboards beneath their weight. Then came the second event, this one impossible to laugh off. From the far end of the hallway, one of the doors slammed shut with a force so violent it echoed through the entire house. Everyone froze. The phone light trembled in Hafiz's friend's hand as they stared down the hallway, the air suddenly too heavy to breathe. No one had been near the door. No wind had passed through the windows. It had slammed shut on its own. "Let's just go back downstairs," one of them whispered, his voice trembling. But the suggestion was drowned out when another friend argued, "No, we came here to prove we're not scared. If we leave now, we'll look like idiots." The conflict rippled through the group, fear clashing with stubborn pride. Hafiz stayed silent, though every instinct told him to leave. He couldn't admit it out loud, not when their eyes would label him a coward. They pressed forward, the tension between them thicker than the shadows around them. The air seemed to hum faintly now, as though the house itself was aware of their argument, feeding off it. The next door they opened revealed something stranger still. It was another empty room, but unlike the others, the floor here was covered in shattered glass, not in random piles, but spread evenly, carefully, as if arranged by hand. In the center of the glass lay an old photograph, curled and yellowed with age. Hafiz crouched to pick it up, his fingers trembling. It was a family portrait, 2 parents and a young girl standing in front of the very same villa when it was new. The girl's face was scratched out, gouged until only white paper showed through. Hafiz slipped the photo back onto the ground, his stomach twisting. The stories he'd heard about Villa Nabila came rushing back. Some claimed the daughter of the family had been murdered in the house, her spirit bound to the walls forever. Others said the entire family had been killed for their wealth, leaving no one to claim the home. Looking at the defaced photograph, those stories suddenly felt less like rumors and more like fragments of truth. As they stood in the room, the atmosphere shifted again. The sound of footsteps returned, slow and dragging, but this time it came from the hallway they had just walked through. One of his friends swung the phone light toward it, but there was nothing there, just the open corridor stretching back toward the stairs. Yet the sound continued. Step, drag, step, drag. Growing closer, panic broke the group's fragile unity. "We need to leave," one insisted, already edging toward the door. But another shook his head, clinging to bravado. "It's probably other kids trying to scare us." The footsteps stopped. Silence again. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, as if answering their debate, the phone light flickered violently, plunging them into near darkness. Hafiz's heart pounded in his chest. He reached instinctively for the nearest shoulder, his breath shallow, his skin cold. The light steadied again, but the group was rattled, their fear now louder than their courage. And then came the whisper a second time. This time clearer, sharper, as though someone was standing directly behind them. A single word, dragged out in a low hiss. Keluar. Get out. Every head turned, eyes wide, but there was nothing there. Just the empty room, the scattered glass, and the defaced photograph staring up at them like a warning they had ignored. The house was no longer subtle. It was speaking to them directly, and for the first time that night, Hafiz realized that Villa Nabila didn't want them to explore, it wanted them gone. But the question that twisted in his mind was darker still. If the villa wanted them to leave, why hadn't it let them yet? The warning still hung in the air, that single whispered word curling around them like smoke. Keluar. Get out. For a moment, the group stood frozen, the silence of the villa pressing down on them, heavier than before. Hafiz could feel his pulse hammering in his temples, every instinct screaming to run, yet his feet remained planted. One of his friends let out a nervous laugh, too sharp and too loud, insisting it must have been someone outside trying to spook them. But even he didn't sound convinced. The others exchanged frantic looks, their earlier bravado collapsing into raw fear. Then the sound came again, this time not a whisper but a loud, unmistakable crash from deeper inside the house. It was so violent the walls seemed to shudder. The boys flinched, spinning toward the noise. Their single beam of light swung wildly across the hallway, illuminating peeling wallpaper, broken doors, and nothing else. The crash had no source, yet its echo lingered as if the house itself was growling at them. Hafiz felt his chest tighten. He wanted to say it out loud, to admit this was wrong, that they should leave now. But the words stuck in his throat. Before he could decide, one of his friends, the boldest of the group, stormed toward the noise, muttering curses under his breath, determined to prove it was nothing. Against his better judgment, Hafiz followed, the others trailing behind like shadows. They entered what appeared to be a dining hall. The roof above was caved in, moonlight dripping through the gaps, casting silver streaks across the floor. The long dining table had rotted away, its remains scattered like bones. At the far end of the room, something new caught Hafiz's attention. The wall, once covered in paint, was blackened as though scorched by fire, and within the charred surface were marks. Not graffiti, not handprints this time. Claw marks. Dozens of them, carved deep into the wall, trailing upward toward the ceiling. The boys went silent. Even the bravest one faltered, his light lingering on the grooves. Animals, he whispered, though no animal left claw marks like that. Hafiz's stomach churned. Something had once tried to claw its way out of this place, or perhaps deeper into it. The air grew colder still. Their breaths came visible, puffs of white mist against the darkness. Then came the sound that would break whatever courage remained among them. A child's laugh. It was faint, high-pitched, echoing through the dining hall as if bouncing off the broken walls. Not playful, not innocent. Twisted, wrong. The group spun in every direction, the phone light shaking as they tried to find the source. The laugh came again, this time closer, darting from one corner of the room to another, too quick for any of them to track. One of the boys shouted, "Who's there?" His voice cracked, betraying his terror. The laughter stopped. Silence stretched for a long, suffocating moment. And then, slowly, something began to move. From the far end of the hall, in the darkness just beyond the light's reach, a shape appeared. Small, crouched, shifting. Hafiz's mouth went dry. It was the outline of a girl, her hair long and tangled, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. She stood just beyond the flickering light, her face obscured, her body trembling as though caught between shadow and substance. The boldest friend stepped forward, raising the phone like a shield. The beam caught her eyes for the briefest moment, hollow, black, glinting with something sharp. She vanished before their eyes, dissolving into the darkness like smoke. The room erupted into chaos. One boy screamed, another stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the debris. Hafiz's chest tightened as panic clawed through him. They had seen her. All of them had seen her, and there was no rational explanation left. Before they could move, the entire house seemed to come alive. The walls groaned, floorboards cracked, and from upstairs came the sound of running, fast, heavy footsteps pounding back and forth. Doors slammed shut in quick succession, bang after bang after bang, as though every room in the villa was sealing itself. The boys clung to one another, their breath shallow, their eyes darting wildly. Hafiz turned toward the doorway, desperate to flee, but the hallway they had entered from was now cloaked in absolute darkness. Their single beam of light flickered, struggled, and died. They were blind. In that suffocating darkness, the sounds grew sharper. Whispers slithered from every direction. Some were in Malay, some in languages Hafiz didn't recognize. Words overlapping, twisting, pressing into their ears until his head throbbed. He couldn't tell what they were saying, but he knew the tone. Anger, grief, hunger. Then, without warning, the whispers stopped. The silence was worse. Something brushed past Hafiz's leg, cold, fast, deliberate. He yelped and stumbled backward, colliding with one of his friends. Another scream erupted as one of the boys dropped to the floor, claiming something had pulled at his ankle. They scrambled, pulling him upright, hearts slamming in their chests. Through the shattered roof, the moonlight shifted, illuminating just enough of the dining hall for Hafiz to see what lay before them. In the center of the floor, where no one had placed it, sat the photograph from before, the family portrait with the scratched-out daughter. Only this time, it was different. The scratch marks were gone. The girl's face had returned. Her hollow, staring eyes looked directly at them. The photograph curled in the chill, the paper darkening as if wet. Slowly, red stains spread across it, bleeding from the image, dripping onto the glass-covered floor. The group stood paralyzed, their fear absolute. Hafiz's entire perspective shifted in that moment. This wasn't just a haunted house. It wasn't just creaking wood or old rumors. Villa Nabila was alive. Watching, responding, playing with them, and they had walked straight into its game. The photograph lay on the floor between them, bleeding red as if the paper itself had veins. Hafiz couldn't move his eyes from the girl's face, her expression flat, yet somehow accusing, her hollow stare reaching across the room to pin them in place. One of his friends hissed, "This is fake, someone's messing with us," but his voice was shaking so hard it betrayed his disbelief. No one dared touch the photo. It pulsed with something alive, something that felt older than all of them. Then came a sound so faint it might have been mistaken for the wind, except there was no wind inside. A voice, low and strained, drifting from somewhere above them. It spoke in broken Malay, words jagged and heavy, like they were being forced through cracked teeth. Anak, hilang, my child, lost. The boys froze. The earlier stories, the ones that had felt like campfire tales, came flooding back into Hafiz's mind. He remembered hearing that Villa Nabila was cursed because of a daughter who had died inside, murdered by jealousy or greed. Others swore the family had been butchered for their wealth, their blood spilled across these very floors. Nobody had ever agreed on the details. But now, standing in the dining hall, the scattered fragments of those tales seemed to thread together with horrifying clarity. The scratched-out girl in the photograph, the claw marks on the wall, the laughter in the dark. The house wasn't haunted by many spirits. It was bound by one, a child. And every strange thing they had experienced, every whisper, every slam of the doors, had been pulling them toward that truth. The sound came again, this time closer. Anak, Kembali, my child, return. One of the boys finally broke. He bolted for the doorway, shoving past the others, but the moment he crossed the threshold, the slam of another door echoed through the villa. His scream followed. They rushed after him, but when they reached the hall, he was gone. Only his phone lay on the floor, the screen still glowing faintly, its recording app still running. Hafiz's stomach dropped. The villa hadn't just been warning them, it had been choosing them. They gathered around the phone, none of them daring to touch it. The screen flickered as though someone, or something, was still holding it. And then, through the speaker, came the sound of breathing. Shallow, ragged, a child's breath pressed against the microphone. The missing boy's voice shouted faintly in the background, panicked, but it was drowned out by that smaller, steadier exhale. The realization hit Hafiz with a chill that sank into his bones. This wasn't a random haunting. The girl wasn't simply appearing at will. She was searching, replacing. The villa itself was a trap, pulling the curious and the reckless inside, feeding the legend with disappearances that were never fully explained. The whispers they had heard earlier no longer sounded like random noise. They were fragments of grief, pieces of a story half lost to time. Hafiz began piecing it together in his head. A daughter taken violently, a family destroyed, a curse that spread through the walls until the villa itself became her vessel. The laughter, the dragging footsteps, the warnings carved into plaster, none of it was meant to scare them away. It was meant to keep them inside, to confuse them, to weaken them, until the villa could take what it wanted. Maybe that's why people go missing, Hafiz whispered, the words slipping out before he realized he had spoken. His friends turned to him, wide-eyed, waiting for him to continue. It doesn't kill them. It replaces them. That's why the stories never make sense, why no one ever agrees on what happened, because it doesn't let the truth leave. His words hung in the heavy air, terrifying in their simplicity. A sudden vibration rattled through the floorboards, as though the villa itself had heard his revelation. Dust rained down from the cracked ceiling, and somewhere above them, the dragging footsteps resumed, faster this time, urgent, circling. The boys huddled together, their fear now mingled with a grim understanding. The legends hadn't been exaggerations. The warnings carved into the walls weren't from thrill-seekers. They were from others like them, caught in the house's grip, desperate to leave behind a message before it was too late. And then Hafiz noticed something that made his blood run cold. On the wall beside them, faint but visible in the pale moonlight, new words had begun to appear. Carved not by hand, but etching themselves into the plaster as they watched. Words that hadn't been there before. Jangan keluar, do not leave. The contradiction cut through Hafiz's thoughts like a knife. A moment ago, the whisper had urged them to get out. Now the walls themselves insisted they stay. which was the truth. Which voice belonged to the girl, and which belonged to something else, something older, darker, hiding behind her story. The revelation shifted everything. Villa Nabila wasn't just haunted by a murdered child, it was a battleground of spirits, voices warring inside the rotting bones of the house. Some wanted them gone, others wanted them trapped forever. The truth was more terrifying than the legend. They weren't just trespassers in a haunted house, they were pawns in a curse that had been festering for decades. And no one, not even the police who dismissed the rumors, truly understood the depth of what lived inside Villa Nabila. For Hafiz, the moment of clarity brought no comfort, because understanding the house's secret didn't free them from it. If anything, it made the walls seem to close tighter, as if the villa knew its game had been exposed and wasn't finished playing yet. The words on the wall glistened in the pale light, fresh and jagged as though carved by invisible hands. Jangan keluar, do not leave. The message seemed to breathe, the grooves wet, alive. Hafiz's chest heaved as he realized the villa was contradicting itself, its voices tearing them in two directions. One whisper begged them to escape, another command demanded they stay. His friends were panicking now, pulling at him, arguing in frantic whispers. Some wanted to bolt down the stairs, others insisted they should stay together and wait. But Hafiz knew waiting wasn't an option. Every second inside felt heavier, like the walls were closing in. The air was thick, almost liquid, pressing against their lungs. Suddenly, the missing boy's phone lit up again. The screen flickered, and an image filled it, a live feed from the camera. Hafiz's blood went cold. The feed wasn't of them, not where they stood. It showed the staircase downstairs, empty except for one figure. The girl. She was standing at the base of the stairs, her head bowed, her long hair veiling her face. Slowly, she raised her head toward the camera, as if she knew they were watching, and then the feed went black. That was enough. Hafiz grabbed the nearest arm and ran, dragging his friends with him. They stumbled down the hallway, the floorboards splintering under their weight, the walls groaning as if in protest. Behind them, the laughter returned, sharp and echoing, chasing them down the corridor. They burst through the front door, tumbling into the night air, gasping as the weight lifted instantly from their chests. The villa loomed behind them, silent once more, its windows dark and watching. For a moment, no one spoke. Their breaths came ragged, their hearts pounding so loud it drowned out the cicadas. But Hafiz couldn't shake what he had seen on the phone. The girl hadn't been trapped in the house. She had been waiting by the only exit. And as they fled down the hill, he realized something that froze him more than the cold air ever could. The villa hadn't tried to keep them inside. It had let them go, which could only mean one thing. It wasn't finished with them yet. 2 houses, 2 countries, yet the same unsettling truth. Villa Nabila in Malaysia and Chaone No. 81 in Beijing share more than crumbling walls and whispered legends. Both were once grand, full of life, only to be swallowed by silence, tragedy, and the weight of rumors that refused to die. Where one tells of vanished teenagers and a child's restless spirit, the other speaks of betrayal, grief, and a woman in white who lingers still. These are not just places on a map. They are wounds in the earth, scars of sorrow that bleed into the present. Step too close, and you don't just hear the past, you feel it pressing in, cold and unshakable. And tonight, we open the door to China's most infamous haunted house. Beijing is a city of contradictions. Towering skyscrapers rise above alleys where old men play chess in the dust. The streets are always alive, horns, bicycles, chatter, the rhythm of a metropolis that never seems to rest. But tucked away behind Chaoyangmen, just beyond the government buildings and embassies, there stands a mansion that doesn't belong to this world. Chaone number 81. A French-style villa built a century ago, once elegant, now a ruin wrapped in vines. Its brickwork crumbles, its windows gape like hollow eyes, and its gates, though rusted, feel less like protection and more like a warning. Our story centers on May, a university student drawn not by bravado but by obsession. She had heard the whispers all her life, how a woman took her own life there after her lover abandoned her, how Red Guards fled in terror during the Cultural Revolution, how ghost hunters claimed to see a woman in white gliding past the broken windows. May wasn't like the thrill-seeking tourists who slipped through the gates for a quick scare. She was studying history, and to her, Chaone number 81 wasn't just a ghost story. It was a mystery buried in plain sight. She wanted to know what really happened inside those walls. On the day she arrived, the sky was heavy with smog, the air pressing down like a damp cloth. May's footsteps echoed too loud on the cracked pavement as she approached the house. Around her, the world seemed to retreat. The laughter of children faded, the traffic sounds thinned, until all that remained was the creak of the iron gate as she pushed it open. Her friends had dared her not to go alone, but May felt compelled to. This wasn't about proving bravery, it was about answers. The courtyard was a jungle of weeds, their stalks brushing against her legs as she made her way to the front steps. A chill lingered in the air, though the sun was still high, the kind of chill that doesn't belong to weather. She stopped for a moment at the threshold, staring up at the peeling paint, the warped shutters, the empty windows that seemed to be staring back. She thought of the stories she had read, how some claimed the woman who died here was the mistress of a high-ranking official, abandoned and disgraced, left with nothing but despair. Others swore she was a Catholic who sought sanctuary during the chaos of revolution, but found only betrayal and death. The truth had been lost in rumor, but May wanted to peel back the layers. She pulled out her small recorder, her voice steady as she spoke into it. Chaone number 80, 1, Beijing's most haunted house, entering for documentation, purpose, to separate myth from history. She clicked it off, slipped it into her bag, and pushed the door open. The hinges groaned like a long, drawn-out sigh. Inside, the air was cooler, thick with dust, and something sharper, like rusted metal. Light slanted through broken windows, cutting the darkness into strips. May stepped inside cautiously, her shoes crunching on shattered glass, scattered across the floor. The once grand entryway stretched before her, its walls covered in cracked plaster, its staircase winding upward like a spine of bone. Her chest tightened. The air felt wrong, heavy, as if it resisted every breath she took. Yet she pressed on, notebook in hand, her pen scratching quick impressions. Foyer stripped, furniture gone. Possible occupation during Cultural Revolution. Evidence of fire damage on second floor. To be confirmed. Still, beneath her careful notes, May couldn't shake the feeling that something was listening, that the house itself was aware of her presence. It wasn't just a ruin, it was waiting. And as she moved deeper into the shadows of Chaone number 81, she realized that separating myth from history might not be possible. Because some places don't just hold memories, they breathe them. They trap them, and they make sure no one who enters ever forgets. The deeper May moved into Chaone number 81, the heavier the air became. It wasn't simply dust and age, there was a weight to it, as though the air itself remembered. Her footsteps echoed up the high ceilings, bouncing back strangely, never quite in rhythm with her own movements. She paused at the base of the staircase, studying the grand curve of wood that had once gleamed with polish. Now it sagged and groaned like an old man's spine. Her recorder clicked on again. Main staircase intact. Evidence of rot. Suggests long-term water damage. Her voice was calm, clinical, but her heart was not. She took a few cautious steps into the hallway that branched off to the left. The smell changed here, less dust, more like mildew, tinged with something faintly metallic. The wallpaper was peeling in long strips, exposing the skeletal bones of the house beneath. May ran her fingers over it lightly, noting how the plaster seemed softer in some places, almost damp. When she pulled her hand back, her fingertips were faintly red. At first she thought it was rust, but it wasn't rust. It looked too much like blood. Her stomach turned. She rubbed her fingers against her jeans, telling herself it was only a stain from the wall, nothing more. But when she lifted her pen to write it down, her hand shook slightly. Further down the corridor, she came across the first room. Its door was gone, lying in splinters on the floor. Inside, shards of glass littered the ground, reflecting thin slices of light from a cracked window. And in the center of the room sat a single chair. It was wooden, simple, and far too intact for a house that had devoured everything else. May frowned, stepping closer. Her recorder clicked, chair left in center, possible staging, previous trespassers. She circled the chair slowly, her pen scribbling. That's when she noticed the floor. The dust around the chair was disturbed, smeared outward in wide arcs, as though someone, or something, had dragged their feet around it over and over again. Yet no other footprints led into or out of the room. May's throat tightened. She leaned down, running her flashlight across the ground. The arcs looked too uneven to be from shoes. Some marks curved like bare toes pressed against the dust. The temperature dropped suddenly. A chill crawled across the back of her neck, raising every hair on her skin. May straightened quickly, her light darting to the corners of the room. Nothing moved. Nothing breathed. Still, she felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. Her pen scratched faster now, her words jagged. Cold spot. Possible psychological reaction. Sense of presence. And then it came. Faint. So faint she thought it might have been her own breath echoing back. A whisper. She froze, her recorder still running in her bag. The whisper was indistinct. A broken thread of sound. But it was there, curling just beneath her ears. She turned slowly toward the doorway. No one stood there. She stepped back into the hall, her pulse quickening. Sound anomaly detected, she said into the recorder, her voice tighter than before. She tried to sound calm, but inside, her certainty was unraveling. The sound hadn't been the creak of wood, not the shuffle of her shoes. It had been words. She was almost sure of it. As she moved further down the corridor, something else caught her attention. On the wall just above the baseboard was a dark smear, faint but deliberate. She leaned closer and realized it wasn't a stain. It was writing, 4 characters scratched into the plaster so deeply the edges flaked apart. She traced them with her light. Buyat Jawa. Do not look for me. May stepped back sharply, her pen nearly falling from her hand. The words were old, gouged with force, yet the message rang like a fresh warning. Who had written it, and what had they meant? The whisper returned, louder this time, clearer. A woman's voice, thin but urgent, curling through the corridor. May's breath hitched, her rational mind grasping for explanations. Wind through broken windows, resonance in the walls. But deep down, she knew better. The first complication had arrived. The house was speaking to her, not through myth, not through rumor, but directly. And though she couldn't yet understand what it wanted, the message was undeniable. Chaone number 81 wasn't going to let her simply take notes and leave. It had decided to involve her in its story. May's breathing grew shallow as she backed away from the gouged words on the wall. Do not look for me. The phrase clung to her like a shadow, raising more questions than answers. Who had left it? A desperate tenant? A victim? Or something older, warning anyone foolish enough to follow her path? Her pen scribbled in frantic strokes across her notebook, but she hardly registered the words. The silence pressed down again, the kind of silence that made the city outside feel 1,000 miles away. She could almost believe the world beyond the gates no longer existed. Then, the second event. From somewhere above came a sharp, dragging sound, like heavy furniture scraping across the floor. May froze, tilting her head toward the ceiling. The sound moved slowly, deliberately, as though someone was rearranging an entire room. But this house had no furniture left, nothing solid enough to make that kind of noise. Her instincts screamed at her to leave. Instead, her historian's curiosity pushed her toward the staircase. Each step moaned beneath her weight, the wood brittle under decades of neglect. As she climbed, the dragging sound stopped. Silence again. May hesitated, gripping her flashlight tighter. At the top of the stairs, a long corridor stretched out, its doors hanging open like mouths. She swept her light across them, her beam catching on a door at the far end. It was closed. Perfectly closed. Her pulse quickened. Every other door was broken, unhinged, but this one stood firm, its paint peeling but intact. She approached slowly, her recorder whispering, "Second floor. Audible disturbance. Closed door ahead." The air grew colder with each step. A faint smell hit her nose. Familiar. Metallic. Blood. May swallowed hard, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle. It resisted at first, stiff from rust, but then gave way with a groan. The room inside was empty. At least, it should have been. But the floor was marked with deep scratches, long parallel grooves carved into the wood as though something heavy had been dragged in circles, over and over again. May's flashlight trembled in her hand as she traced the scratches to the far wall. That's when she saw it, an outline faintly visible on the plaster, like a shadow burned into the wall itself. The figure of a woman. Head bowed, arms outstretched. Her heart skipped. She stumbled back, her light darting away, but when she swung it back, the outline was gone. Just bare wall. May turned sharply, clutching her notebook to her chest. That's when she realized she wasn't alone. At the doorway stood a man, or at least what looked like one. His figure was faint, barely there, like smoke trying to take shape. He stood tall, shoulders squared, his gaze fixed on her. May's flashlight passed over him, and he seemed to dissolve into the beam, reforming when the light moved away. Her voice broke as she whispered into the recorder. Figure observed. Male, possibly military uniform. The man didn't move closer, but his presence was undeniable, and worse, angry. May could feel it radiating off him. A sharp hostility that pressed into her chest. A conflict stirred in her mind. Was this the soldier rumored to have abandoned the woman who died here, or something else entirely? Then the air shifted again, and she heard it. A woman's voice, whispering from the wall behind her. Not words this time, a cry, low, broken, full of grief. May spun around, but nothing was there. Her rational mind fractured. The man in the doorway, the crying woman in the wall, the warnings scratched into plaster. It was too much. Were they separate spirits, or fragments of the same tragedy? Was the house replaying a story that had no end? Her pen fell from her hand as she stepped backward, desperate to escape the room. Her heel struck something hard. She turned quickly and saw another message carved into the floorboards, so faint she had nearly missed it. 3 characters, simple but chilling. Bie hui to, do not turn back. May's breath hitched. The words were new, fresh, as though carved for her. The figure in the doorway was gone. The crying had stopped. Silence stretched around her, thick and suffocating. She tightened her grip on the flashlight, her mind racing. The house wasn't just showing her pieces of its past. It was speaking to her directly, warning her, testing her. And though every instinct told her to run, she couldn't yet. She had come for answers, but Chaone number 81 wasn't giving them freely. It was only raising the most terrifying question of all. What happens if she ignores the warnings? The warning carved into the floor, "Do not turn back," burned itself into May's mind. Her chest rose and fell in shallow gasps as she stood frozen in that upstairs room, the air around her colder than any Beijing winter. Every nerve screamed for her to flee, but her historian's obsession clashed violently with raw fear. The house wasn't just haunted, it was communicating, and it wanted her to make a choice. Her flashlight flickered once, twice, before holding steady again. The silence was unbearable. Then, from behind her, came the unmistakable sound of footsteps, soft, bare, slowly padding across the floor. They were coming closer, deliberate, and unhurried. May's entire body tensed. The warning replayed in her head. Do not turn back. Her instincts warred with her reason. What kind of researcher ignores what's behind them? But what kind of survivor disobeys a message carved fresh into the wood? She clenched her fists, sweat dripping from her palms despite the icy air. The footsteps stopped directly behind her. She could feel it, the weight of someone there. The air shifted as though displaced by another body. Her breath clouded in front of her, rising in trembling wisps. Then came the voice. A woman's voice, low and ragged, almost brushing her ear. Why did you come? May's throat locked. She wanted to answer, to explain, but no sound came out. The silence stretched, suffocating, until the voice came again. Louder this time. Broken. Angry. Why did you come? Her heart slammed against her ribs. She wanted to bolt for the door, but her legs wouldn't move. Instead, she forced her shaking hand to lift the flashlight, pointing it forward into the empty room. For a split second, she thought she saw her own shadow on the far wall, except it wasn't hers. The silhouette of a woman stood outlined against the cracked plaster, her head tilted, her hair long and loose, her body trembling faintly. May blinked, and the shadow vanished. The voice came again, this time from every direction at once. Why did you come? The pressure was unbearable. May spun suddenly, breaking the warning, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing. No one stood there, just the gouged floorboards and the yawning hallway beyond. Her knees nearly buckled with relief, but it didn't last. Because as she turned back toward the room, the figure was there. Not a shadow this time. A woman. She stood at the far corner, half shrouded in darkness. Her white dress was tattered, stained in places that looked far too much like dried blood. Her face was pale, hollow, with eyes so dark they seemed to pull all the light from the room. Her lips moved slowly, though no sound came out. May stumbled backward, her breath ragged. The flashlight quivered in her grip, the beam jerking across the walls, but the woman didn't vanish like before. She stayed, watching. The air thickened, heavy with grief so strong, May felt it pressing against her chest, stealing her breath. For the first time, she understood the legend not as a story but as a wound. This was the woman abandoned, the one left behind. Her sorrow had curdled into rage, and that rage had been fed by decades of silence. Then, from the hallway behind May, came another sound. Heavy boots, marching, the unmistakable rhythm of soldiers' steps. May's mind raced. The soldier she had glimpsed before. The woman in the corner. Two presences colliding, overlapping in the same decaying house. Were they bound together, replaying the same tragedy? Or were they enemies, locked in an endless war of betrayal and grief? The boots grew louder, closer. The woman's mouth opened wider, her face twisting, though still no sound escaped. May pressed herself against the wall, her light darting wildly between the doorway and the figure in white. she was trapped. If she ran into the hall, she'd meet the boots. If she stayed, she was alone with the woman. Suddenly, the recorder in her bag clicked on by itself. May hadn't touched it. From its speaker spilled a voice she knew was not hers. The woman's voice, ragged and strained. "Don't let him in." May's blood ran cold. The house wasn't just showing her fragments of the past anymore. It was using her tools, her recorder, to force the message through. She yanked it from the bag, staring at it in horror as the voice continued, whispering, pleading, "Don't let him in." The boots stopped just outside the room. Silence again, thick and pressing. May's flashlight caught the shadow of a man stretching long across the floorboards, even though nothing visible stood in the doorway. The woman in white raised her hand slowly, pointing toward it, her expression twisting into something between fear and fury. The air cracked, the walls groaned. The floor beneath May shuddered like the house itself was breathing. She realized then that this wasn't just a haunting. It wasn't just grief replaying on a loop. She was in the middle of a struggle. One spirit begging for help, another trying to force its way through. And the house itself, the bones of Chaone No. 81, was the stage for their endless confrontation. Her historian's curiosity shattered. This wasn't about uncovering truth anymore. This was survival. She clutched the recorder tight, her flashlight trembling in her other hand as the woman's voice surged louder, desperate now. "Don't let him in." And in that moment, May understood something terrifying. The house wasn't asking her to leave. It was asking her to choose. The voice on the recorder grew fainter, as if the batteries were draining, but the words still carried, "Don't let him in." May stood trembling in the dark room, her flashlight clutched so tightly her knuckles burned white. The woman in the corner lowered her hand, her hollow eyes fixed on the doorway where the soldier's shadow lingered. The air was alive with tension, charged like the moment before a storm. May's rational mind scrambled to keep up. Every story she'd read, every rumor about Chaone No. 81, suddenly began to twist together into something clearer. The woman who had taken her life, abandoned by her lover. Perhaps the lover wasn't a faceless man. Perhaps he had been a soldier, a man of rank who left her behind to face ruin. The Red Guards who fled the mansion during the Cultural Revolution, they hadn't just been spooked by superstition. They had stepped into this same battlefield, caught between the grief of the woman and the oppressive presence of the man. It reframed everything May had seen. The claw marks on the wall weren't random, they were desperation, a soul clawing to escape what hunted her. The whispers she heard in the corridor weren't disembodied nonsense, they were fragments of a plea. "Do not look for me. Do not turn back." Warnings not to follow the soldier's path. Warnings not to repeat his betrayal. Her breath came shallow, the pieces sliding into place. The house wasn't haunted by countless lost spirits, as the legends claimed. It was haunted by one story, the unfinished story of a woman who had been abandoned, her sorrow festering until it became part of the walls themselves. And now that sorrow reached out to anyone who dared step inside, dragging them into her endless cycle of despair. The soldier's shadow shifted against the doorway, stretching long across the warped floorboards. The sound of his boots thudded once more, shaking the air though no figure materialized. The woman in white trembled, her face contorted in silent anguish. May realized that everything she had experienced, the chair surrounded by footprints, the voices etched into plaster, the carved warning not to turn back, hadn't been designed to scare her away. They had been designed to prepare her. The house was less a trap and more a theater, replaying the tragedy over and over, searching for an ending. The woman's hollow eyes turned toward May, locking her in place. For the first time, her lips moved with sound, a whisper so faint it blended with the groan of the old house. "Tell it right." May's heart seized. She was a historian. She had come here to document truth. But the woman wasn't asking for history, she was asking for her story to be told, her suffering to be remembered as more than a rumor. Her recorder crackled again, the static bending into words, not her own. A deeper voice, this time. A man's voice, cold and commanding. She lies. May nearly dropped the device. Her pulse thundered in her ears as the soldier's presence swelled, pressing into the room like a dark tide. The woman in white staggered back, her form fading into the corner as though being smothered. It hit May then. The true nature of Chaone No. 81 wasn't just a haunting. It was a war of voices. The man and the woman, forever bound to the house, locked in a struggle to control the story. One sought release through remembrance, the other sought silence through fear. The legends May had heard before, screams in the night, apparitions in windows, shadows pacing the halls, they weren't random hauntings. They were echoes of that fight, seeping into the world of the living, twisting into whatever shape would keep the cycle alive. May's chest ached with the weight of it. Her purpose had been clear at first, to separate myth from history, but now she understood that history itself was the myth. The truth wasn't in dusty archives or official records. It was here, alive, warring within these crumbling walls. The soldier's voice rose louder, booming through the recorder, though no hand touched it. Leave, forget. The woman's voice cut through, fragile but fierce, carried on the cold air itself. Stay, remember. May's perspective shattered. Every sound she had dismissed as rats, every cold draft she had blamed on broken windows, every flicker of light she had thought was her imagination, none of it had been random. It had all been the house speaking to her, pulling her deeper, demanding she witness the truth behind the legend. And now she stood in the center of it, caught between two forces. One begged her to run, to erase what she had seen. The other demanded she carry the weight of memory out with her. The revelation left her trembling. Chaone No. 81 wasn't cursed because of death. It was cursed because the story never ended. It dragged anyone who entered into the same question, the same impossible choice, silence or remembrance. May gripped the recorder tightly, her mind racing. For the first time, she understood why no one ever agreed on what haunted this place. Why stories conflicted, why details were always blurred. Each visitor walked away with fragments, shaped by whichever voice they listened to. The true horror wasn't the woman or the soldier. It was the fact that the house itself ensured no one left with the full truth. And as May stared into the hollow eyes of the woman in white, watching her fade and flicker like a dying flame, she realized something chilling. The house wasn't going to let her leave as a bystander. It had chosen her as the next keeper of the story. May's grip on the recorder was so tight it hurt. The voices had stopped. The soldier's shadow no longer stretched across the floor. The woman in white was gone, dissolved into the walls like smoke sinking into stone. The silence that followed wasn't relief. It was suffocating, as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what she would do. Her instincts screamed at her to run. And this time, she listened. She bolted from the room, her flashlight beam bouncing wildly off the peeling walls as she tore down the staircase. The boards groaned beneath her feet, the entire house seeming to shudder with each step. She didn't look back. Not at the hallway, not at the rooms, not at the scratches carved into plaster. The front door loomed ahead, warped and swollen with age. She shoved it open, the hinges screaming like an animal in pain. Cold night air hit her face, and she stumbled into the overgrown courtyard, gasping as though she'd surfaced from deep water. The city was out there again, traffic, neon glow, life, but it all felt distant, unreal, as though she had stepped out of one world and into another. For a moment she stood there, bent over, her breath shaking. Then she heard it, a soft click from her bag, the recorder. She pulled it out with trembling hands. The screen glowed faintly, the battery almost dead. A new file had been saved. She hadn't touched it. With shaking fingers, she pressed play. At first, only static. Then, slowly, the sound of her own voice, clear and steady. Chaone number 80. 1. Beijing's most haunted house. Entering for documentation. Purpose: to separate myth from history. It was her introduction, word for word, but she hadn't been speaking alone. Beneath her voice, layered like a second track, was another, a woman's whisper, fragile but unmistakable. Tell it right. The recording ended abruptly. The silence that followed pressed against May harder than any scream. She stared at the glowing screen, her chest tight, her mind racing. Had she escaped the house? Or had the house followed her out?